Thank you all so much for being here this morning. I want to tell you, you're in for a real treat with this panel discussion. I hope you're having as much fun this week as I am. I got to tell you, you're running on caffeine and a little sleep, but this has been such a wonderful conference, and like I said, I hope you've enjoyed it half as much as I have. To get us started, I wanted to remind you that if you look on page 10 in your program book, we have a new feature to this year's conference called Build Your Own, and it'll tell you how to go about signing up to host a conversation of your choice, and people can then sign up to join you for that conversation. So read about it on page 10, and then if you're interested, please go sign up right across from the registration desk. So to get us started this morning, I want to introduce Rosemarie Vardell because she'll be moderating this session. And I've known Rosemarie for only a couple of years personally, but for many years I've known of her work. So she's written down some things here that I want to tell you about, and then I'm going to tell you the real Rosemarie. So she's worked in the early childhood field for about 35 years. And during this time she has been leading quality early childhood programs, teaching, training, supporting the early childhood workforce to offer high-quality programs for all children, facilitating the development of teachers as leaders and mentors. And this is one of the things I think she does best, although everything she does well. She advocates for fair and equitable state and federal policies that impact young children and families. In 2010 to 2012, while at NCA&T, Dr. Vardell was principal investigator on a cultural competence project funded by the North Carolina Division of Child Development and Early Education to pilot the Breakthrough Collaborative Series approach for strengthening the knowledge and skills of the early childhood workforce. She's currently serving as a teaching consultant on the Cultural Competence Breakthrough Series Collaborative funded by the Early Learning Challenge Grant. And I had a great opportunity to work with her early on at the very beginning of that project. Yeah. So now the real Rosemarie. You're going to enjoy her so much because not only does she have all these years of experience and great wisdom, she's a fun person to go to a baseball game with, and she's also a great person to sit on her porch with, have a glass of wine, and solve all the world's problems. We have had some deep philosophical conversations, and we keep thinking if we could just get more people on this porch, just think how many problems of the world could be solved. So please join me in welcoming Rosemarie Vardell.
Thank you, Cindy, and for not telling all the secrets. I appreciate that. It's good to see you all this morning. I'm glad you made the choice to join us in this conversation. By way of getting started, we have in our states and communities a real richness of diversity in culture, language, social, ethnic, racial groups. This gives us the opportunity to enhance our lives by seeing the world not only as the way we see it, but through the experiences of other people in our communities. So diversity is not a problem. It creates amazing opportunities for us. However, there is a major problem that exists. It's the unequal access to economic stability, to appropriate education, and to good health that exist to create a pattern of disparity and inequity that's related to race, social class, and ethnicity. So this morning, we want to explore some of these patterns in depth, look at some of the current work to reverse these disparities, and also to share with you a model for equipping our workforce to work across different cultural groups. And we have a great panel to help us do that. And I will introduce them all at the same time and let them flow into their presentations. And then we'll have plenty of time for your comments, your questions, and to engage with each other. So we have Yolie Flores, who is from California, and she is the senior fellow in the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, a collaborative effort of foundations, nonprofit partners, states and communities from across the nation to ensure that more children from low-income families succeed in school. And particularly in this role, Yolie is leading the work on successful parents and engaging with parents to ensure that more children are reading at grade level by grade 3. She also has served as president and CEO of Communities for Teaching Excellence, a national education advocacy organization working to ensure effective teaching for every student. There's much more that Yolie has accomplished over the years, but we will share that at this point. And really, I want you to get to know these folks more through what they have to share with you. Sharon Ritchie, who you may have already met at her book signing.
No, it's next.
It's next. Oh, well, then this is the advertisement for the book signing about her work at FirstSchool. She has a lot of broad experience over her career, including being a teacher, a program director, consultant, researcher. But this is impressive. She has taught from children who are 3 up to university. She's developed and reinvented the NAOAC accreditation process and authored the self-study materials. But for the past 9 years, she's been the director of FirstSchool, a pre-K to grade 3 school. And she'll be sharing about that experience, which is very related to our topic this morning. Anna Mercer-McLean has been at this also for a good number of years. Anna is currently the director of a community school for people under 6, and she has been in that role for over 24 years. It's an excellent NAOIC accredited program in Carborough, in this state in North Carolina. And Anna is also, she served on the NAOIC board. She is currently serves on the NCPC partnership. And Anna was a learning facilitator in the cultural collaborative project that we'll be talking about, and that's what she'll be sharing as well. So I'm going to step aside and let Yolie start.
So happy to be here with all of you. And I want to just share, first of all, that my task is a very exciting task this morning. And it's also a little bit nerve-wracking when you talk about demographics. So my job is to talk to you and to set the context for really the experts in early education that will go deeper about what it means to be thinking about our field, the field of early education, and the changing face of early education. So I want to take you through a set of slides to really paint the picture of who really are children now and will be in the future, to make the case for why we need to think very deeply, very strategically about our workforce and about the field. And I also will share a few slides that will, I hope, create for all of us a sense of urgency of why this work is so important. So let me start with the background and some of the demographics. And I'll explain some of these charts for you, but I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So this chart really is helping us to see that the U.S. is growing much more diverse, but even more so in the early years. So the proportion of white, non-Hispanic young children decreased from approximately 66% in 1990 to what you see today, 50%. So you see the red arrow showing us that 50%, in fact, of the population are children of color, where non-white are the other 50%. We also know that, it's not on this chart, that 1 in 4 of the nation's 23 million children under age 6 are born to immigrant parents. So we've doubled the number of children with immigrant parents from 2.9 million in 1990 to 5.8 million. This chart also gives us a little bit more information about socioeconomic status. So children, young children in particular, are most likely to live in low-income households, those below 200% of poverty. And we know that 40% of children living in poverty were attending center-based programs, compared to about 72% of better-off families. Well, this is what the future will look like. Almost all of the growth in child population will be kids of color. Of the projected increase in the child population, approximately 10 million, only 300,000 are white, 6 million are Latino. So this is the changing face of our children and of early childhood. And just to give you another chart, you'll see this is now projecting to 2050. And you'll see the decline from the 1980s to 2050 of the white non-Hispanic population, and then an increase in almost all of the other ethnic groups. So by 2023, less than half of all children are projected to be white non-Hispanic. By 2050, 62% of the nation's children will be minorities, up from 44% today. And then here's one more chart taking us into the future to 2050, and you'll see the increases from 2000 to 2013 to 2050, both for 3 groups: Asian, African American, and Latino. Actually, before I get to this chart, let me say just a couple of other things. I said to you when I started that some of this worries me and worries us, and here's one of the things that worries me in particular. The child population is growing the most rapidly in some of the states with the worst outcomes for children. So the 5 states, and I was worried about naming states, but one of them is my own, and we just have to face the facts. But the 5 states with the most growth are actually at the bottom 50% of child well-being, and those 5 states, again, including my own, California, so Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. So let me just turn now to children in early education. These are numbers from 2012. We have 7.8 million children, 3 to 4-year-olds in early education. That's 64.3%. And then this is the breakdown of our kids. So we have 4 million white, 1.8 million Latino, 1.1 million black, 379,000 Asian. And you'll see the percentages there. In terms of breakdown of color, in 2015, 44% of these kids are children of color, but by 2050, it will be 64.3%. So now let's take a look at the workforce. I took these actually from just one state to give you an idea of what the workforce looks like compared to the child population. So we just saw what both the current and future face of our children will be, yet the early education workforce is not fully reflective of the child population. And here, this is a snapshot of California. And what I want you to look at here is that red arrow telling us that 70% of the children 0 to 5 are children of color. And 53% of center-based teachers are white, and 42% of the family child care providers are white. this chart, and I wanted to highlight the Latino group, because when I go from this chart to this chart, and we look at the other ethnic groups, it may not seem way off, but if we take a look at Latinos in the first chart, oops, wrong one, which you'll see is 50% of the California children 0 to 5 are Latino. And then we go here, only 13% of the workforce is Latino. It's a little bit more on par with other ethnic groups, but not all. So let me say now something a little bit about the science. So not only does the workforce not match the new face of early education, it also isn't prepared to meet the needs of young children, given what we now know about how children learn, what we know about brain development and neuroscience, about trauma, about language, about early literacy, and what it will take for children to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. We've seen this in a couple of recent reports. This one is by the Institute of Medicine, Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth through Age 8. And we've seen it more recently with the immigrant and refugee workers in the early education field. I want to say just something about this particular report, which actually just came out last week or maybe 2 weeks ago. This report highlights the workforce, and although it does not yet reflect the changing and growing diversity of our child population, we do know that 1/5 of the overall workforce are immigrants. However, the report calls out is that these immigrant workers and the linguistic and cultural diversity that they bring to the field are highly overrepresented in the most lower skilled and lower paying sectors of the profession, such as family-based child care workers. Few hold leadership positions, such as center directors, and few work as pre-K teachers. So despite the increasing demand for culturally and linguistically sensitive ECE workforce, the competencies are often not recognized as important. Less than 1/4 of the workforce speaks a language other than English, and there is a mismatch between the growing diversity of languages spoken by immigrant children and families and the languages typically spoken in the ECE workforce. So very, very quickly, what are the implications and the consequences? And I want to take you through this to show you just how critical and how urgent our work is. And I'll show you again by just taking taking a group of states and looking at NAEP scores. So we all work in this field because we are preparing young children to succeed in school and succeed in life, right? This is why we do this work. And one of the first markers of success for young children is whether or not by the time they reach 3rd grade or 4th grade, they can read proficiently. That is my work today with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Our sense of urgency is knowing that 80% of children from low-income families do not read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. Let me repeat that. 80% of children in this country from low-income families do not read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. And that matters because reading proficiently is the strongest predictor of high school graduation and obviously going on to college and career. We will not break intergenerational poverty in this country until all kids can read. So, let's just take the largest growing group of children in this country, Latino children, and what we know about how they're reading, whether they're reading or not at grade level, looking at NAEP scores. And my good friend Antonia Lopez from NCLR was sharing this information, so I actually just put it on my chart last night. She shared with me the 12 build states and how they're doing on reading with NAEP. So she gave me the Arizona numbers. My friend Aaliyah from Arizona is here. We have 201,961 0 to 4-year-olds. By the time these 4-year-olds get to 4th grade, and this is when they take the NAEP test, 52% are reading below basic. So how many children does that add up to? 105,020. Children who are reading below basic by 3rd grade rarely move out of below basic. And then we have California, and you'll see those numbers. Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. For just 12 states, if we added up all these numbers, oh, and I forgot Washington. Let's do the math. 1,404,443 children in only 12 states are not reading proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. I just want you to wrap your head around what the consequences are for 1.5 million children every 4 years. And we project that with the projections of the child population to 2050, what the consequences are for our nation and what the consequences will be for those children. And I am certain that who will have the most impact in reversing these numbers are 2 important stakeholders, parents and their caregivers. I'm going to end just by lifting up another critical piece here, and that's African American boys. So we also saw growth in the African American population, and boys in particular. And I wanted to add this slide here. It's a little bit off point, but not really, because it does speak to the need to change our workforce. Black children represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but make up 48% of preschool children receiving more than 1 out-of-school suspension. Boys of all color receive more than 3 of 4 of all out-of-school preschool suspensions. Hispanic and African American boys combined represent 46% of all boys in preschool, but 66% of the same age peers who are suspended. Analysis of boys compared to girls indicate that they make up 79% of the preschool suspended once, and 82% of preschoolers suspended multiple times. So what does this also tell us about our field, about the preparation that is needed, about who is teaching our children? Do we truly deeply understand the culture, the language, the traditions of our kids, what really matters in our families? My belief is that when we begin to think about who is in front of these kids and how we train and how we recruit, that we will have a very different approach in how we work with young children. I think those are the challenges of our field.
So Yolie set me up to ask the essential question. She didn't even know she was going to set me up for that. The faces of these boys let us know that even at a very young age, they have already received frequent and repeated messages that they don't belong and they're not valued. It's no wonder, because I'm going to reiterate some of what Yolie said, they are isolated within their own classrooms, they're subject to arbitrary rules, They are overrepresented in suspensions, retentions, referrals, discipline, and subsequently in dropout rates, and they're overlooked for their gifted and talented potential. Although this is a familiar litany, it sadly bears repeating. In order for dropout prevention to actually start early, it's essential to help educators examine the minute-by-minute experiences of these children to illuminate the microaggressions they suffer and to shift the responsibility from their shoulders and those of their families to the institutions that do not sufficiently question policies and practices on their behalf. Although you will hear from our observations that there's much to be improved upon, please also hear that we are pro-educator and believe that research, new lenses through which to view practice, professional development, and support are their due. Observations for the past 20 years in schools highly populated by children of color and those who come from less advantaged homes reveal patterns of inconsistency, a predominance of teacher talk, and expectations of silence and compliance. We use 2 observation measures to provide data so that teachers can use the results to inquire into their practice, to inform change efforts, and to guide and monitor their progress. In light of school climates where apprehension and fear of consequences and reprisals for poor data results prevail, we work with leadership to help them move from a mindset of evaluation to one of inquiry and continuous improvement. We use the class measure to help us get a picture of teacher-child interactions across 3 domains: emotional climate, classroom organization, and instructional climate. This is an example of typical data from an emotional climate domain for pre-K through 3rd grade. What is regularly apparent is that as children move between pre-K and the K-12 system and try to get a sense of what school is really about, is that the climate becomes less positive and more negative, that teachers are less sensitive and have less regard for who children are and what they think and know. In light of the particular importance of the development of self-efficacy and a racial and cultural identity, this is notable. We know that it's vital for children to have at least 2 good years in a row in order to have a positive educational trajectory, and that this is particularly true for our most vulnerable kids. And we use this data to help teachers focus on important areas to ensure more consistent environments for their children. Can I have my water? Any water? Thanks. We use a measure called the EduSnap to provide teachers with a picture of what their children experience on a minute-by-minute basis throughout the school day. In this graph, we help teachers look at the activity settings that their children experience within their own classrooms and also get a view of what it looks like as kids move from grade to grade. As all of you well know, programs for children aged 0 to 5 have the primary aim of helping children learn to negotiate space, materials, and relationships. They're given support to develop self-regulation and autonomy, and yet typically, as they enter the kindergarten door, these practices and the concept of choice are replaced by teacher control in whole group settings. And an expectation that for a quarter of the day that they be in charge of their own learning. And this is too typically true in worksheets. We ask teachers to consider the effect of such a dramatic change on the backs of 5-year-olds. We help them think about ways to smooth these transitions, to think about developmentally appropriate practices that should exist across the pre-K3 spectrum. We also pose questions to teachers about how children handle long periods in whole group or in working on their own. Too often, teachers identify boys and boys of color as the children who are in trouble or distracted during these times. Our goal is to improve the minute-by-minute experiences of children and talk to teachers about how practices such as having to turn their cards, miss an ice cream party, sit out recess, be threatened with a phone call home, how that impacts their feeling of whether they belong and whether they are valued. The message of belonging and value not only impacts the children who are struggling with expectations, but also to those who watch and start coming to their own conclusions about who belongs and who is valued in schools. In this slide, we look at the amount of time that children spend in components of balanced literacy. The focus on professional development and literacy has had a positive impact. We see a lot of literacy being taught, and we see a balance between eyes on text and phonemic awareness. We also see something so pervasive that we have come to call it a culture of silence. That no matter what state, what district, what age group we look at, that there is an average of only 28 minutes per day of meaningful conversation between teachers and children, and that intentional vocabulary development is almost non-existent. This is despite the research that tells us that oral language and vocabulary development are the strongest predictors of third grade outcomes. We ask teachers to consider, how do you know what children have learned if you don't ask them? We're particularly concerned as we think about children of color and their need to have a voice, to know that what they think, what they know, what they feel, and who they are is valued by their teachers and by their peers. We knew we had to respond to what we see as the state of schooling, particularly for children of color and those who come from less advantaged homes. We know also that teachers are overwhelmed and that we needed to think about what the essential aspects of instruction were. We took a deep dive into the literature to find those practices, and they ended up falling logically into 3 cultures that must build upon one another. Children must be cared for and valued across developmental domains and for who they are culturally and racially. They must see themselves as skilled and competent contributors to the classroom and have a chance to move from minimal competencies to excellence. We help teachers link these instructional practices to research and to their data in their quest for equity in their own classrooms. This is our mandate. We must help educators and administrators question practices that perpetuate inequity. We must attend to inconsistencies and ensure that children, especially children of color, are given the respect and quality education that they deserve. And we must support teachers and administrators with the knowledge and ability to prioritize at least 2 things: be nice and let the children talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon and Yolie. There's some powerful information that's been put before us. Before we move to Anna, we want to give you a chance to ask a question or make a brief comment, just to see if there's anything in what they presented you'd like to know more about at this moment. There's a microphone in the middle of the room, and we'll need to use that so that we can hear each other. So please feel free to step up to the microphone.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning, yes.
So thank you for bringing this conversation to the table. I work in Arizona, and I have been in the educational system for some years. And race, culture, ethnicity is often the elephant in the room. And so my question to you is, how would you recommend that those of us on the practitioner level, those of us in middle management, how do we begin to start the conversation in a meaningful way in many communities that don't even want to address the race issue because it's a very delicate topic? Some people are comfortable, some are not. But we can't continue to not address this. So any steps to initiate the conversation?
I just had an opportunity to hear Robert Putnam speak last week. He just wrote a book, All Our Kids. And I think getting that book into the hands of people in power is important, because he's able to tell the story of what's happening to children across this country, and the divide between low-income children growing up in low-income communities, from the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and what we were providing, not just those children, but all children, as an opportunity to grow up and thrive, and what that meant to the American economy. And then he fast forwards to today, and he paints the picture of the hometown that he grew up in Iowa, and looks at other communities that were vibrant and that were blue-collar working families, and the opportunities that those families had regardless of race. And they were, he talks about his community, and it was a mixed community, somewhat diverse. But what I like about how he is, the consequences and the implications are less from, even though we know that this is also important, from a moral imperative to an economic imperative. And he has, interestingly, gotten the attention from governors in states that would normally not be interested, because those are those kids. So one proposal is to, have him come out and speak, do a town hall, because I think that his work is going to change the conversation, but we need to lift up and create those conversations in our communities.
I think one of the best lessons that I ever learned as an educator was to remember always to say what's true. And, and I heard from what you were saying of the urgency, and I hear again and again and again, it's a hard topic for people, they're uncomfortable, tough. We have been dancing around this issue and paying more attention to it being a hard conversation than we have to outcome for kids. And I think we have to be brave.
Thank you for that question. Anyone else want to raise something? Well, keep thinking, because we'll have a chance to come back to you again. So Anna, we'll turn it over to you.
I so appreciate Yolie and Sharon coming before me this morning, because they bring some amazing statistics that we all need to hear. I've been involved in this process since 2006 to make a difference in my own program, and I got involved with the Cultural Competence Breakthrough Series Collaborative Project as a result of the work that we've been doing over that time. And it brings to light one of the relevant reasons why we needed to move forward and be a part of a project like the Cultural Competence Project. So we wanted to strengthen cultural competence in the early childhood field. So we talked about some other statistics. So these are some other relevant questions around culture for early childhood. So one of the things is there is an overrepresentation of minority children in poverty and at risk. So when we think about all the things that are happening in our programs and in our communities, there are differences. We know that there are goals for childbearing, rearing that are different. We know that parent practices are different. Developmental milestones for children are different. And children's cultural identities, which Yolie talked about earlier, the language and skills are different. And they start at a very early age, and we need to address that at that early age. And then cultural and linguistic continuity between home and the community and your child care programs is essential in order for children to be healthy. We all know that. But until we address those issues, that doesn't change. So the Cultural Competence Breakthrough Series actually was based on this model. There's a lot to that. It's a long process that we went through for over 18 months. Many of the folks that were included in that were administrators. They were teachers, parents, technical assistance folks, professional development specialists. Everyone was involved in this process, but it started out with an expert panel that put this all together to bring together needs assessments, to look at a framework, to look at bring together the people who were going to be involved in this process, the faculty, and then to recruit people who were going to be a part of the program, including all the people I mentioned before. And we went through a learning session, 3 of those sessions. And then we had action periods in which this allowed the opportunity for people to be involved in a process of learning, a process that we'll talk about context in a minute, that took them through that, whether they did needs assessment, monitoring, and matrix, and keeping up with some of the statistics as they went along, to really figure out what their programs were doing and how to improve upon those, and have great outcomes for what the teens would do in the end, and how to make that a more widespread learning across the state. So these were some of the content areas that we talked about. So my focus as a part of the core learning, as a core learning facilitator, was working with administrators. So we talked about leading change, and we talked about diversity of staff. We talked about the policies and practices. But then there were other leaders who worked on this project who were addressing the social cultural self-awareness, and they were looking at the outlook of socialization and transforming practices through family engagement, which is a major part of this process. And then we looked at teaching practices and coaching, and we had to look at dual language learners as a part of this process. So you'll see that there were great topics that were a part of this project. So let's look at what cultural competence means, because this is where we all want to get to. It is the integration and transformation of knowledge, information, and data about children, families, and groups of people into compatible and specific standards, skills, service approaches, techniques, and programs that match child and family culture and increases the quality and appropriateness of care and outcomes. This is where we wanted to go. But we couldn't just go there from the very beginning. We had to have a starting process. So we had a framework. This framework that you see, which is the cultural competence conceptual framework, was originally adopted through the Papadopoulos model. It's a health model. It talked about how health providers care for patients. That was the original version of this. So the first step of this was awareness. The awareness phase took us through self-awareness of ourselves, cultural identity of our own, identifying our own cultural identity and heritage adherence, ethnocentricity, stereotyping, and ethnohistory. That was the first stage. So that's where we wanted people to begin. And when you talk about, what do we do, how do we get people involved, there has to be a beginning step, a first step. This is it. We have to want to be aware. And then after we become aware, we want to gain more knowledge. We want to learn more. We were able to provide additional information, and people decided they want to reach out and find information for themselves. Now, the Papadopoulos model moved on to a third stage of sensitivity, which used to be in a little rectangle just like the others. But guess what we discovered through this project? That you had to have heart. We had to have sensitivity. We had to have respect. And we had to have trust through this process. Because when you talk about the elephant in the room and people don't want to talk about it, that's where you have to start having the opportunity to start trusting each other and start having an understanding about the things that have happened in our lives and moving forward, and how, most importantly, it will change the lives of children. And then the final stage was competence, moving to that phase, which we just talked about, which dealt with the assessments and the clinical skills, and it dealt with challenges and addressed those. It dealt with prejudice and discrimination. But in the center of that was desire, because you had to have the desire and commitment to be a part of this project, to do this work, and to move forward in terms of making a difference for young children and their families. Now, you'll see around it, it just doesn't stop there. You have to be engaged. You have to have accountability. You have to have assessments through this process, and you have to be planning and monitoring through this process. And you have to have a leadership that's there to support you in this process. So the leadership is administrators, it's your boards, it's agencies, it's all the institutions that have a say in what needs to happen for children and are willing to make a difference. This is a major framework, and it really made a difference in the lives of those who participated. And some of those participants may be in the room now. So where we want teachers and educators to be, and if you're working with children or on behalf of children, we want to have culturally responsive teaching. That means we want people to be teaching through the strengths of children, through the children's culture. We want to validate and affirm that children, the child, by using their cultural knowledge. We want to have prior experiences and frames of reference for them and performance styles so that we can use their learning experiences and do it effectively and relevantly. So this project had some outcomes on its own. So there were centers, as I said, family child care providers participated, and they all participated in the cultural competence, were trained in that, and the Breakthrough Series Improvement process. There were TAs and professional development specialists who were also trained and actually went through the curriculum process. And then we actually developed this curriculum that many of the TAs and professional development specialists have now been endorsed in here in North Carolina. And that is a 0.5 CEU. So we came up with some other recommendations through this process as well. These recommendations were geared around policies and practices, both for the state and locally, and for the program. So I want to share those with you. But before I say that, one of the things we have to do is to make sure that because of all this change in demographics, we know that we have to engage families, we have to connect, we have to build relationships in order to make a difference for children. So you have to be willing to do that. So here are the recommendations. So the staff recommendations was to ensure that cultural competence training opportunities occur, both for administrators, owners, staff, family child care providers. Establish professional development plans that address cultural competence. Ensure cultural competence is included in the recruitment process when you're hiring teachers. And there's an evaluation process as a part of that. And then create a staff environment that reflects cultural competence, racial makeup of the community served by the program. So you know that already, based on the statistics we shared, that the programs do not reflect, the teachers teaching do not reflect the children who are being served. Some family engagement recommendations. Create an enrollment process. You need to have materials that reflect variations in the family structures and the language and the goals. You know, as a part of that, some of the programs ended up changing their information and making sure that it was written in Spanish because they didn't have it that way before. There were lots of wonderful ideas and activities that came out of that changed many programs. We want to ensure that families have the opportunity to be a part of the policies, develop the policies of the center, the classroom practices, give feedback and assessment. And we wanted to involve families in the goals for children. Whether that's where you sit down and talk with children families at the beginning, at enrollment, through your pre-orientation, whether that's going on home visits with families to talk and learn more about those children and how we can better serve them in the classrooms. And we wanted to make sure we continue to involve them in the child's progress and strategies for facilitating their positive growth and outcomes. And then there were program practice recommendations. So we had to have specific criteria that assess cultural competence of the program and maintain that. How do we assess whether we're culturally competent? There was a scale that was developed that can be used that will help determine whether your organization is culturally competent. Maintain a curriculum that includes culturally relevant content around teaching strategies, culturally and linguistic teaching strategies. We wanted to provide assessments that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. And we wanted to make sure we paid special attention to the dual language learners and making sure we had strategies to support them. And lastly, there were agencies and funding recommendations. And that's to make sure that there's compensation and funding to support improving cultural competence in early childhood programs and in agencies. And we wanted to make sure we're improving the ability of all staff to provide cultural competence services through professional development and supervision, and to be able to provide that process for ongoing self-assessment, and to provide those strategies to improve and in terms of being a culturally competent organization. This was a wonderful project to participate in, and I think it made a big difference in many of the participants in that program. And even as I served as a learning facilitator, it actually made a difference in my own program. So when we talk about steps, this is one of the ways that we can start that process. And until we actually make a step, there will not be a difference for young children and families.
Thank you, Anna. Any questions, comments for Anna or any of the others before we get into some good discussion around this? Yes.
Anna, I just want to thank you for sharing that important work. And in the spirit of sharing, also in North Carolina, I just wanted to comment and let you know that there are a group of Smart Start leaders for the last 4 years who have been taking that deeper dive, using structural racism as the lens to look into the data on kids, see what the root cause is, and then bring invited guests in the community together for a 2-day retreat called Leading for Equity. But not only do they work with these cross-sector folks in the community, it could be health, it could be faith, it could be any sector. They have also gone through 3 days of intensive training themselves with a group of people here out of North Carolina about that structural racism and the lens that we must have going forward with all of this work in the community to move people from talk to action and truly incorporating this into the way that they look at kids and programs and people in general.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are coming to a core piece to take away from this, which is this idea of urgency and truth-telling around what's happening. Other comments? Yes.
This is actually a comment as well. Yesterday I was in a workshop and one of the gentlemen talked about we really have to get tough and get in people's faces now when we think about addressing early childhood education and how critical it is, because this is a really nice industry It's a soft, nice industry. So I love the word tough. I thought desire was one of the most powerful words that I saw in that whole thing, because that really is the core. If that desire isn't there, those things around it won't happen. And I don't know if you can make reading required for board members, but possibly they should all be required to read Robert Putnam's book. So anyway, but I just wanted to thank you. I think it's all very interesting, and it certainly is something that that really as a nation has to be looked at very, very carefully.
Thank you.
Yes,
please.
I want to just add a little bit to that, and it goes back to Aaliyah, your question to us. You know, sometimes I can be very pragmatic, but my experience, I was a member of the school board in Los Angeles, and one of the things that I learned as a school board member very early on is that if you weren't willing to tell the truth, if you weren't willing to be tough, and if you weren't willing to take a risk and be courageous, then you had no business being on that board. And I remember putting forth some pretty controversial policies that rattled all of LA for a couple of years. And before I did that, my staff sat me down and said, you know, you will never get reelected again. You will never. You can say goodbye to political elected office. And I thought about it for just a split second. And what I remember saying to them is, you know, I don't really care. I really don't care, because I have my education. I can read. I can probably get a job anywhere in the world. I speak 3 languages. But these children, 70% of kids that we were failing at LA Unified, they will never, if you think about where our global economy is going and where the jobs will be, these children will never, ever have those opportunities. And so I didn't ever get reelected again. But I didn't run again. But you have to be willing, if you really have that desire, if you know the truth. And my affection for the early childhood field is so huge because more than any profession, my experience, it cares the most. But we are too nice. And if we want to do something about that drastic demographic change, and more importantly, how so many kids of color, low-income kids, will never have a shot at achieving and achieving their greatest aspirations, then we have to take some risk. We have to tell people, whether they like it or not, what has to change.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. It's more of a comment. I think that when we're talking about the cultural competence piece for the achieving gap of African American boys by the 3rd grade level, I think it's twofold. I think it's cultural competence and having your personnel to reflect the children that you serve, but with that is also the lack of representation of male educators in the classrooms, that these young boys can really say, he can understand my struggle. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody want to?
I would agree that I would like to see more males in the field of early childhood and education, and so it's important.
Absolutely.
Good morning. Good
yes,
morning.
Good morning.
Tremendous panel. Thank you so much for bringing to light the important work that we have to do. I'm from Ohio, and we're getting ready to embark upon a statewide rollout of our early childhood mental health consultants to really drill down on the preschool expulsion phenomenon. And I wanted to learn a little bit more from our panel and any and all of you, where, as a state, at the state, where we can begin to apply and deploy this workforce expansion to have the most meaningful impact on the preschool expulsion rates. So I'm looking at that intersection between the burden of the teachers and administrators and the rest of the community, be they Help Me Grow workers, community linkage workers, mental health consultants, the rest of us that have to do this lifting as well.
Good question. Good question.
Well, I would actually say for for preschoolers and for the children that you're working with, it all starts the day they come to your program. It starts the day you sit down with a parent when they walk in the door. And when you start having those conversations with parents about, how do you raise your child? What do they like? What are their interests? What challenges are you having, or do you have any challenges? When you start to have a simple conversation with families about what can we do to best serve you and your child, that begins that conversation. And when you start developing that trust and that relationship with a parent, they will start to share with you some of the things that you need to know to make sure you don't get to a certain point down the road. Whether you know a child, when a parent tells you whether their child needs, they're having trouble with speech, or whether they need some help with behavior. I'm having some challenges with parenting, they won't go to sleep. Those are the conversations we have at an early age. And when teachers can, instead of having the stress of dealing with that with not knowing, they actually know how to help parents start at home and then work together.
I think also that having conversations with teachers about, when does this particular child or a group of children get in trouble? When are there problems happening? And that, so often what we're trying to do is fix the child. Let's fix the classroom.
We're going to ask you to engage in a short, come, yes, and then we'll move to a quick discussion, yes.
I'm wondering, I was happy to hear that the Obama administration is talking about increasing subsidies to be able to increase salaries. What can we do to help encourage more people of color to get training in these programs, and then also increase wages so that men and women will want to do these jobs? Because I said to the lady next to me, men are never going to do this work because men aren't willing to work for nothing as women are willing to work for nothing, because we've lived our lives that way. So when do we see some shift there, or how can we make some shift there to make this a desirable field for people and to really encourage and welcome people of color into the educational programs that will lead them into these jobs?
Good.
I think that's the $64 million question that this field has been struggling with for a very, very long time. And so you all know why then advocacy is so important, why policy is so important. And we just have to be relentless. We have to be relentless about the future of children, the future of this nation. And it starts, we have the science now. We know how consequential it is for children in the first 3 years of life, the first 5 years of life. We have to be relentless in lifting that up. Not nice anymore. Professional, yes. But, some of the strongest advocacy movements required us to be courageous and tough.
I think that there's something internal for when we do get men in the field. That's what happens. Is that they get promoted immediately. I mean, you look at who becomes principals, who becomes program directors, who becomes curriculum people. The men are, as soon as they get in the classroom, in 3 years, their trajectory is right out of it. And I think that, that trying to talk about the value of keeping men in the classrooms with the kids is just so important. Again, I don't know how we're going to do that, but.
Absolutely.
I would just say this is a great opportunity while we're in the process of coming up with the policies around the Child Development Block Grant, that you need to take the opportunity to reach out to those who are taking care of that and say that everything we do should involve compensation, so that no policy or practice should be put in place unless they've added a compensation piece in that. So, take a look at doing that first. We want males in the field, but we also want women to have the fair, equitable wages that they deserve first and foremost as well.
Thank you. Just to underline that, recently released was a study that was about worthy wages, worthy work, still unlivable wages. Many of you saw that. That report said that 46% of the people working in early childhood programs are on some sort of public support. Some sort of public support. So how do we expect that teachers can do their very best, relate to parents, be compassionate when they, in fact, are struggling themselves? So working to lift children out of poverty when they can't, when they can't make it. So I just think Anna's right. We have to keep raising that at every single funding moment, or it will continue to be the invisible problem that never gets solved, and it will hold us back from the goals that we have been talking about today. Anybody else have a question or comment? So we have just a few more minutes, and I do want to invite you, not to this question, but to this one. We've been touching on this, and we've certainly had it raised how crucial this is about how we can prepare our workforce to work most effectively with all of our children, but particularly those children that we were talking about today. So I'm going to just ask you to take 5 minutes, turn to a little group next to you, and talk about either what you're doing or you think what needs to be done in your communities. And let's see what we can learn from each other. So let's take 5 minutes, short conversation, and then we'll see what you've learned.
No, I don't know. Rosemarie can probably tell you where it is. There's a whole lot of stuff.
Okay. Where is
Well,
it?
the framework, that framework is actually, if you look it up on the website, Papadopoulos, you can find it.
Under what?
Papadopoulos, TP and Taylor models.
I know. Oh, dear.
Cultural companies.
I didn't see a phone the whole time. That's good. I didn't see a phone the whole time.
That's good.
That's amazing. Now there's people talking. You know, that's good.
So Anna, do you have that framework on your
Yeah, that's
website?
what I just asked.
I was just saying, the framework is on the website. You can look it up on the TP, but not that version of it.
Because that is really good.
That's my most favorite part.
Yeah, that framework is awesome. And your definition of cultural competence. That was
Sharon Glover did amazing work, and Rosemarie and the expert team did amazing work on this project.
Yeah, that's a great project.
And was it just North Carolina?
Yeah, did 3 regions, Eastern, Western, and it was an early learning challenge project when we did Winston-Salem State University.
Oh, great. Oh, there's a good decimal here. Yeah, they're talking. Yeah.
That project process, I just got so fascinated. It really gives people enough time. It gives them a chance to write down. It promoted more reflection.
That's the whole point. If you don't have that, you're not doing anything. That's fantastic.
And so it's a good process. And we did develop, as Anna said, curriculum. There's money in the grant to personal part. So it's not sufficient at all. So we really need to do this. It was hard. We lost teams. Foundation of our system.
done a little webinar. We've also presented to you after participating. Yeah. I mean, Sharon actually did all of this work with DCD.
What did you say that got you unelected?
I was pushing for teacher quality. I was pushing for childhood. I was pushing for children's society.
Did she say Robert? What's Robert? Bowling. Statistics to see how this project actually affected those programs that actually went through that process. You can see a major difference in the teachers and administrators and just all the I wish they had continued going in between all the project and connected all these other I couldn't participate. I was the core learner facilitator, but I couldn't have myself participate when I had been short-staffed. So, however, it benefited me because I could take, what I'm learning and take it back. I said, but I still want to take them in and see the use. Project, we endorsed the people who had to be endorsed at the end before they could even teach the curriculum at the end of this process.
I think we'll wrap it up. We would like to hear from a few of you about the kinds of things you talked about before we make our way out this morning. So if there are a few folks who are willing just to share some of what you talked about, either things that are happening or challenges that you're facing in regard to the workforce. That would be great. Just step up to the mic, or if you have a big voice, just stand where you are. You want to stand up so they can hear you? Or share Anna's mic.
You can share my mic. Sure. Yes, is it? I share well.
Well, what we was talking about was how a lot of times the teachers that's in early childhood show the least amount of classroom sensitivity, because you might have a kid that's acting out, and instead of them dealing with the kids, the reason why they acting out, they just seeing the behavior versus seeing the kid's problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we also was talking about the meals in the classroom, and I felt some type of way because I looked in here, and it's probably not just it's just a couple handful of males and a lot of ladies. So when y'all said that they get promoted quick, that's in elementary. But y'all also said the first 3 years of a child's life is what's most important. Mm-hmm. So if a male is not present in a child's life, say they not in early education, it's hard for a male to get involved in early education because of all the things that they get labeled as.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And so how is a kid, a boy, period, supposed to identify how to be a male? Especially if that male presence is not at home.
Absolutely. There are.
I will add that as a part of the cultural awareness for males in the field, that's a responsibility we as administrators need to take on to help support and educate families about the importance of the male role and the role that they play in the lives of children, so that we take away some of those stereotypes. Because I enjoy having males in my program, so it's a wonderful thing. So.
Oh, was that a job interview?
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for raising that. And I think for some of these things that we know we can't change immediately, we've got to start getting there in some way, even if it's having people come into the program initially as volunteers or whatever it is. We can't just say, this is not possible. We need to get on our way with it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, that could be an attraction to going into this field, all the ladies. So it just kind of hit me that way. But no, I'm taking this somewhat as a personal challenge, and I'm with Smart Start of Brunswick County, which is at the east end of the state. But through our R&R department, I mean, we can now start really think about developing trainings for teachers to start looking exactly at this issue. I mean, you know, the teachers in the classrooms are doing things with the children, but it's the teachers that need this as well. So that will be a 15-16 goal for Smart Start of Brunswick County to make sure that starts happening through our training department of the R&R. So.
You know, thank you for that, because I think that really raises the point of we have to make these things stated parts of our mission and our strategies and not be something that's a nice thing to do when we can get around to it, but it becomes front and center. This has to be a priority. I'm going to ease us out by asking our panel members if there's one thing you'd like to share after engaging in this conversation with folks today, something that you're going away with.
I just want to add, you know, I think it's important that we all become culturally aware, but it doesn't just start in the classroom. It starts with each one of us as an individual, and that's what I found out through this project. So if you're working for an agency, you all need to come together and have a conversation yourselves as an agency. If you're working as a child care program, then it needs to happen in the child care program. But it starts with you as an individual and deciding that, you know, you need to take a first step at your own cultural identity and look at where you are and where you want to be and how you want to support children and families.
For me, having this room be full from 10:30 to noon to talk about this topic, to hear good questions, to hear about great work, to listen to the decibel level as you were talking to each other, it's what we need. It's promising and it's hopeful, and you know, that's a lovely thing to see.
The last thing I will leave with, and it's building on, Anna, your focus on parents and family engagement, and it's, for me, one of the most critical opportunities as we think about how we strengthen the workforce is really insisting and being intentional about the relationships between caregivers and parents. I said earlier that I think when we can get it right and support parents in the way we need to support parents, and caregivers and support caregivers in the way that we need to support them with compensation and everything else, that we really can move the dial. And for me, the most powerful question to start with parents: what are your hopes and dreams for your child? And that opens up that trusting relationship, because that parent then feels this person is in it with me. And now what can we do together? And forging those relationships between parents and caregivers is powerful.
I have also very much appreciated the energy that you brought to this conversation and this session, and making the connection between the well-being of the workforce and their ability to do what needs to be done to move forward. The other day I heard a story about how children who are not succeeding, who are really struggling, who feel not a part of their schools and their communities, don't have dreams for themselves anymore. They don't have dreams about where they might be, where they might go. And so at this moment, it feels like we may have to dream on behalf of them until we can get there, so that they have that kind of life that allows them to have dreams about who they are and where they can go. Thank you all so much for coming and your participation.